A mountain range in Colorado was lulled into the twilight of late evening. Darkness enveloped the woodlands, hiding them under a blanket of silence and cold wind. A lone photographer, Cyrus, walked slowly along a winding path that he knew like the back of his hand. His work often took him to wild places, far from civilization, where perfect wildlife shots could be found. Right now, his only company was the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the crackling of branches, and the rare cries of wild birds. Cyrus stopped for a second, inhaled deeply the cold air, feeling it fill his lungs with freshness. But this moment of solitary silence was suddenly broken by a sudden, deafening sound, a booming rumble that swept through the night sky. At first it was difficult to distinguish it among the natural noises of the forest, but after a second it became more and more distinct, growing. Cyrus' eyes instinctively turned to the sky, and he saw a trail of fire, brightly cutting through the dark surface of the sky. Something was falling from the sky, something huge and fast. The flame engulfed the falling object like a comet, scattering bright sparks. Cyrus froze in place, his breathing quickened. A collision is inevitable. Did he not know that it was a plane, a meteorite? Anyway, it was something he had never seen before. There was tension in the air, like before a storm. Then there was a thud. The object crashed into the ground somewhere nearby, behind a forest ridge. An explosive wave swept through the forest, disturbing the foliage and causing the trees to tilt for a moment. Birds flew into the sky, raising an alarm cry. Cyrus instinctively clutched the camera in his hands, but quickly realized that the footage would not be the main thing here right now. He stood motionless for a long time, reflecting on what had happened, until he realized that his legs had already moved of their own accord towards the flash. His steps were getting faster by the minute. Something inside him was pulling him there, to the place of the fall. It felt like he had to be there, like something important was going to happen. No more than 10 minutes had passed when Cyrus, making his way through dense thickets, finally saw smoke rising into the sky through the trees. As he got closer, his heart began to beat faster. A field of destruction opened up in front of him. Sand and rocks were scattered on the sides. The soil was turned up as if the earth shuddered in pain. In the center of the crater, surrounded by debris, lay an object that did not look like an earthly technique. Huge, dark, and glistening in the moonlight. It looked as if it had come from another world. Its surface was smooth, but with many deep cracks and holes from where smoke was still pouring out. One of its compartments was open, and a bluish glow was streaming from inside. Cyrus couldn't believe his eyes. His brain refused to accept what he was seeing. He did not know what it was, but it was definitely not an airplane, not a satellite. It was something much bigger and more alien than he could have imagined. His instincts told him to retreat, to leave before it was too late, but his feet continued to approach the wreckage step by step. Curiosity was still burning inside him, the desire to see what was hidden inside this alien from heaven. When he got close enough to make out the details, his gaze fell on something stranger than the ship itself. Inside one of the holes, among the sparks and a thin layer of smoke, a figure was moving. At first it seemed to him that it was some kind of mechanism. The silhouette was tall and unnaturally graceful. But then, looking closer, he realized it was something alive. A thin, graceful figure with silvery skin and long, luminous hair slowly came out as if emerging from the rubble of some nightmare. Her movements were strangely gentle, but at the same time unnatural, as if the gravity of this planet was something new to her. Serena, Cyrus did not know her name, but at that moment their eyes met, and a strange connection was instantly established between them. She looked straight at him, her eyes glowing with a soft blue light, and this glow penetrated him through and through to the very soul. It wasn't just a look, it was the touch of her mind on his mind. He felt his breathing falter, something rising inside him, fear mixed with admiration, with the feeling that he was standing in front of something incomprehensible and majestic. Serena slowly emerged from the wreckage. Her movements were careful, as if every step was new to her. Her slender figure, shrouded in a subtle light, almost glowed in the night. The wind barely touched her hair, creating the illusion that she was floating instead of walking. Cyrus froze, unable to move. He couldn't figure out what kind of creature was standing in front of him. It was like a vision, like a waking dream, too real to be true. They stood opposite each other in absolute silence. Cyrus tried to make sense of what was happening. His head was filled with countless questions, but each of them seemed out of place at this moment. All that mattered were her eyes, which were like two shining stars in the night sky. Suddenly, he felt something change inside him, as if she was penetrating his mind, searching. Serenith seemed to be studying him the same way he was studying her. She was clearly exhausted. Her movements were slow, but there was a hidden power in them. Her feet, barely touching the ground, were not adapted to this gravity, but she continued to walk forward towards him. He could feel his heart beating faster, as a strange feeling arose inside him, a mixture of fear and attraction. He couldn't figure out what she was, but her presence overshadowed everything else. Then, without warning, Serenith lost her balance and fell to her knees. Her breathing became ragged. Her body seemed unable to bear this world anymore. Cyrus instantly rushed forward, instinctively picking her up. Her skin was unexpectedly warm in his hands, although it looked as cold as metal. He felt her body tense under his touch, but she didn't resist. He didn't know why he was doing this, but her fall had awakened something deeper in him, something that made him act. He lifted her to her feet, and their eyes met again. Now that she was so close, he felt how much more he felt her energy, something powerful, unearthly, but at the same time familiar, as if he already knew her. They stood like that for a few seconds, each studying the other. Cyrus didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment they were both connected by something that went beyond words and understanding. A small, barely audible sound pierced the silence. It was her ship, which was slowly sinking into ashes and debris, disappearing into the depths of the forest. He didn't matter anymore. All that mattered now was here between them. Cyrus led her through the dense forest, supporting her by the hand, trying to keep her balance on slippery, moss-covered rocks. The sky overhead was gradually clearing of dark clouds, and the moon was beginning to illuminate their path with its cold, silvery light. He felt her presence as keenly as he had never felt anything before. His palm felt her skin, surprisingly warm and smooth, as if she were not made of flesh, but of some new material that defied explanation. Every time her fingers lightly squeezed his arm, a faint discharge passed through his body, as if her touch carried electricity. He knew almost nothing about her. Her appearance, her movements, even her breathing, were so alien and strange that it was difficult for him to relate this creature to something familiar. She wasn't just an alien, her essence seemed beyond his comprehension. She moved smoothly, but with hesitation, as if every step she took was exploring a new world. Her eyes, which shone with a faint blue light, reflected a depth he did not understand, something that he could not comprehend, but could not take his eyes off it. They walked in silence. No words, no explanations. She hadn't said a word yet, and he hadn't tried to ask her. There was something more to this silence, something that could not be destroyed by awkward conversation. The presence of another person nearby was not unusual for Cyrus, but with Serenith it seemed that every joint movement of theirs carried a hidden meaning. They reached his cabin on the edge of the forest when night had already completely enveloped the earth. The house was a simple log cabin with small windows and a veranda, but in the moonlight it looked like a quiet shelter, cut off from the rest of the world. Cyrus opened the door, letting her go ahead, and suddenly realized how out of place she looked in this earthly space. Her figure, her posture, her very image seemed so alien that for a moment he felt a sharp contrast between her existence and everything else. As soon as she walked inside, he noticed how her gaze began to wander around the room, examining every detail. The book on the table, the blanket hanging from the armchair, the old picture on the wall. All this was strange to her, almost exotic. Cyrus watched her, his thoughts racing between fear and admiration. He didn't know what to do next. There was little in his life that could prepare him for an encounter with an alien being, much less one like her. Serenith didn't seem to feel fear or anxiety, but her movements were careful. She walked slowly to the window and stood for a moment looking at the forest behind the glass. The moonlight outlined the contours of her figure, giving her an almost ghostly appearance. At that moment, Cyrus felt a feeling flare up inside him that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just curiosity or even fear. It was something more, something that was slowly igniting inside, like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. He realized that he was attracted to her. It was a strange, inexplicable attraction that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't caused by her appearance. She was too different for it to be just a physical desire. It was something deeper, something that seemed to be the result of their silent bond. He felt an invisible thread stretching between them, which was getting stronger by the second. Serena turned her head and their gazes met again. This time there was more to her eyes than just studying. Cyrus felt his breathing quicken and his heart beat faster. She took a step toward him, a slow, almost hesitant step. But that moment was enough for everything to change, for he knew something was going on, that they couldn't just ignore the connection anymore. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his face. This touch was so light, but at the same time powerful, like a lightning strike. His skin flared under her fingers with a warmth that spread throughout his body. He felt his mind fill with strange images, brief flashes of something distant, unearthly. Were these her memories? Or were these the feelings she was experiencing at that moment? That time seemed to stand still. Cyrus stood rooted to the spot, unable to take his eyes off her face, which seemed so calm, but at the same time full of something unimaginable. She slowly ran her fingers over his cheek, studying him as if it were the most important touch of her. Her movements were so gentle that they seemed almost unreal. It wasn't just physical contact, it was something more, something that connected them on a level they couldn't yet understand. Instinctively, he leaned closer. His breathing became quieter, and her fingers continued to slide over his skin, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake. Their faces were so close to each other that he could feel her breathing light and almost imperceptible like the wind. At that moment, tension arose between them, so strong that it seemed as if the air around them had become dense. It was more than an attraction. It was something that drew them to each other, making them forget about everything. Serenith closed her eyes for a moment as if she was immersed in this feeling, as if this moment was something sacred for her. Her fingers finally dropped and she took a step back, her eyes meeting his gaze again. But something has changed. Now they both knew that it wasn't just a casual touch. At that moment, they realized that something more than just curiosity had arisen between them. It was a force that couldn't be ignored. They stood in silence. There were no words between them, but everyone knew that this moment had changed everything. Cyrus, feeling his heart pounding in his chest, tried to make sense of what had happened, but his thoughts were too confused. He wanted to say something, but the words didn't come to mind. All that mattered was their bond, which was getting stronger by the moment. Serenith looked at him as if she was trying to figure out what he was feeling, but her eyes were full of riddles that he couldn't solve. She took another step towards the window and looked out at the night sky again. Outside the window, under the moonlight, the forest seemed calm and quiet, but there was a fire burning inside them both that they could not control yet. This fire was irresistible and mysterious, like the very nature of their bond. Iris, without taking his eyes off her silhouette, realized that they were both on the verge of something unknown. This moment became the starting point for something bigger, something that would change their lives forever. After the silence of the night absorbed the tension that had arisen between Cyrus and Serenith, they both remained standing in the room, immersed in their own thoughts. The events that had taken place since the crash defied logic, but they continued to remain a reality. Glances, touches, unspoken emotions. All this turned out to be tied up in their interaction, leaving a feeling of unresolved mystery that constantly hung in the air. Cyrus couldn't help but think that the alien next to him had literally changed his entire perception of the world. And although he didn't understand exactly how or why it happened, every moment with her was electrifying. Even in her silence, he felt something pulling him towards her like a magnet. But everything she did seemed both familiar and alien. Serenith, in turn, explored this new world, finding every detail strange and unpredictable. In her world, touching had a different meaning, more functional and cold. Here on Earth, a simple physical touch had profound emotional and sensory consequences. She was still trying to understand and get used to it. Her body, created for a different rhythm of life, slowly adapted to new conditions, but every step along this path opened up new sensations. After long minutes of silence, their presence together in the small room began to feel too cramped. Suddenly, Cyrus felt that they needed to get out into the fresh air to relieve this strange tension. He gestured to the door, inviting her to follow him. They went outside. The night was even darker than before, but now the sky, illuminated by the stars, seemed clear and open. The moonlight gave everything a silvery glow. Serenith stopped on the threshold of the house. Her eyes immediately turned upward to the boundless expanse of space. This kind of star was more familiar to her than anything else on this planet. They were part of her past, part of the universe she belonged to. But now those stars no longer called her back as they had in the beginning. They became silent witnesses to her new reality. Cyrus watched her, realizing that her connection to the sky and the stars was deeper than he could have. She stood motionless, as if frozen under these heavenly bodies, but he could see how her chest rose and fell slightly in the rhythm of her breathing, how her eyes followed every flash of distant stars. It was clear that this moment meant something to her. He stepped forward and gently touched her shoulder. It was a deliberate movement, but cautious, almost fearful. He wanted to get her attention, to bring her out of her contemplation. And as soon as his fingers touched her skin, he felt the same faint electric discharge that he had already experienced earlier. But now the sensation was more intense, as if her body had responded to the touch with a special force. Serena turned her head and their eyes met again. This time, her eyes shone with a faint bluish light that made him freeze for a moment. It was something extraordinary. Her gaze seemed to penetrate his thoughts, felt his emotions. She didn't pull away from his touch, but her body responded to him in a different way than one would expect from an ordinary person. She leaned forward slightly, as if she was ready to continue this interaction. For her, touching the ground was something incredibly new. Her skin was designed to interact with other energies, and human touch brought her sensations that her brain was not prepared to process. It was a new form of sensory perception that seemed to immerse her in a stream of unknown sensation. She felt the warmth of his fingers, not like physical warmth, but like a deep, penetrating wave of energy. She raised her hand, and her fingers lightly touched his wrist, as if checking what kind of strange phenomenon it was. Her touch was soft, but at the same time there was a power in it, penetrating through his skin, as if she could feel all his emotions. This tactile contact was like a window into his essence for her. She felt his anxiety, his confusion, and at the same time a strange feeling of attraction which he himself was not fully aware of yet. Cyrus held his breath. Her touch was light, almost weightless, but every moment her fingers touched him felt like an eternity. He felt their bond, that strange invisible thread, become even stronger. He wanted to understand what it meant, but he couldn't find an explanation. His thoughts began to get confused, but his body seemed to respond to her touch before his mind did. Serenith took her hand away, but her gaze wouldn't let go of him. She seemed intrigued by what had just happened. Her skin still retained the residual sensations of that contact. She couldn't explain it on the level of her logic, but something in this world, these strange touches, was beginning to open up a new form of understanding for her. The sensations were so intense that they seemed almost painful, but at the same time they attracted her. This was her first real contact with someone else's body, but not in the context of her mission, but on a deeper level. Cyrus saw her trying to make sense of everything that was happening to her. He was immersed in this process himself, not understanding what was next. This moment of touching wasn't just a random gesture. It was something more, something that would connect them on a level they couldn't have. The night around them seemed even deeper and quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The emptiness of the sounds was almost deafening, as if the forest, the stars, and everything around had stopped to witness their interaction. They were standing side by side, too close to be just acquaintances, but it's still too far away to be anything more. Serena slowly lowered her hand. Her face remained unreadable, but there was something new in her eyes. Cyrus knew that her emotions were a mystery to him, but her body, her movements spoke for her. He felt that something was going on between them that was beyond his experience. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It was something at the level of their essences, something that crossed the border between the rational and the material. At that moment, Serena took another step towards him, her feet making no sound on the ground, and she was almost sliding towards him. He didn't back down. They were both on the verge of something, but neither of them knew what to do next. His breathing became ragged, and her eyes continued to glow, reflecting the moonlight like two bottomless wells. She touched his hand again, but this time the touch was more confident, as if she had decided to find out what kind of energy was between them. Her fingers moved over his skin again, and every moment of this contact made her feel strange but pleasant. Her body was slowly adapting to the new world, but this world was full of unknown feelings and sensations that made her explore it even deeper. Cyrus felt her touch permeate him, causing new waves of emotions in him that he could not explain. It was a strange, almost hypnotic sensation that defied reasonable explanation. He could feel his body reacting to her touch, as if she was awakening something inside him that had been sleeping up to this point. Serena took her hand away, and at that moment, everything seemed to freeze. They stood next to each other, their faces illuminated by the moonlight, and the forest around them seemed alive, watching their every move. It was more than just touching. The silence after the touch filled the space between them, becoming palpable, almost physical. They were on the verge of something new, but neither Serena nor Cyrus could figure out exactly what was going on. It was more than just the meeting of two beings from different worlds. It was the awakening of something deep inside both of them. There was an opportunity in that silence, an opportunity that could turn their entire reality upside down. Serena took her hand away, but her body still felt those strange impulses that she received from touching a person. She could not immediately comprehend this feeling. Her brain, accustomed to cold, logical decisions, did not know how to process this new sensory perception. But her body, which was slowly adapting to earthly conditions, began to understand. Here, on this planet, emotions and sensations played an important role. It was a different world, a world in which feelings were not just side effects of existence, but the basis. Her skin remembered Cyrus's touch. The warmth of his fingers, the slight pulsation under her skin, the feeling of his life. It was something new for her. On her home planet, physical contact was purely functional. No attachment, no emotion. But here on Earth, it was more than that. Touching was a way of communicating, a way of understanding. And it brought with it not only physical sensations, but also awakened something inside her mind that she had not known before. She was standing there, her gaze was fixed forward, but she couldn't see anything. Her mind was immersed in analyzing what had just happened. She felt that something inside her was beginning to change, not only at the level of perception, but also at a deeper level that she could not yet fully comprehend. It was like waking up from a long sleep, slow but inevitable. Her body and mind were beginning to react to Cyrus's presence in a different way than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, Cyrus stood a few steps away from her, trying to make sense of his own feelings. His fingers still remembered her cool skin, but it wasn't just a physical memory. That touch seemed to leave a mark on his mind. He felt that there was more between them than just a chance meeting. But he couldn't tell what exactly. This feeling was both frightening and attractive. He watched her, seeing how she was lost in her thoughts. She stood motionless, her body seemed relaxed, but at the same time focused. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, but he knew she wasn't looking at the stars. She is immersed in herself, deep into the new world that she has begun to discover here on Earth. And this awakening that he felt in her was beginning to awaken his own feelings as well. Suddenly, Serena took a slow, barely noticeable step forward, as if instinctively responding to an inner call. Her movements were smooth, almost imperceptible, like a light breeze that could not disturb the harmony of the night. Something new flashed in her eyes, still glowing with a bluish light. It wasn't just a study or an attempt to understand the world around us. It was the realization of something more important, something that had started inside her, and she couldn't stop the process. She touched the ground again, but now it was different. Her body began to feel the world around her differently. She felt every step, every stone, every grain of sand that came her way. This new world was now not just an alien planet, but something with which it was beginning to become one. This process was gradual but profound. Her body began to perceive the Earth not as a temporary place of residence, but as something more. Cyrus saw these changes but could not fully understand what was happening. He felt that something was awakening inside himself, something that was connected to her presence. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced before. It was more than just a physical attraction. It was an emotional connection that developed on an intuitive level. He understood that something was going on between them, but he couldn't put into words what it was. His gaze slid over her figure, which was slowly moving across the open area in front of his house. Saren had stopped at the edge of a small cliff, looking down at the forest and valley immersed in moonlight. The wind ruffled her hair, and at that moment she seemed to be part of this world, part of the night. She was not an alien being. She had become something else, something new. Her movements were full of grace, but there was something strangely familiar about them. Cyrus stepped forward but did not dare to come any closer. He felt that this moment was important to her, and he didn't want to break it. He knew that this was the time of her personal discovery, her awakening, and he could only watch. But at that moment, he realized that her awakening was somehow connected to him. He didn't understand how or why, but he felt it as clearly as her presence next to him. Serena, still standing on the edge of the cliff, suddenly raised her hand as if trying to catch the wind. Her movements were smooth and almost magical. She closed her eyes, and her face was illuminated by the soft moonlight. It seemed that she was listening to something that was available only to her. The melody of nature, the whisper of the stars, or the song of the wind. It was a moment of complete fusion with the world around her, a moment when she became a part of something bigger. Her mind was filled with strange sensations, emotions that she couldn't explain. It was something new, something that aroused both fear and admiration in her. She felt how her body responded to these emotions, how every nerve became alive, how every cell of her body accepted new sensations. It was an awakening on a level she couldn't have realized before. Her mind, which was used to analyzing and planning, was now completely consumed by these feelings. It was a new kind of perception, emotional and sensual, which defied logical explanation. It was like touching something inexplicable but surprisingly real. And at the center of it all was him, Cyrus. His presence, his energy became the catalyst for this process. Serena suddenly felt her breathing getting deeper. Her chest lifted slightly, and she opened her eyes again, looking at the night sky. She felt that something had changed in her, that she was no longer who she had been up to that moment. This world, these stars, this man, it all became part of her new reality, part of her new awakening. She turned to Cyrus and their eyes met again. But now her eyes did not have that cold gleam that they had at the beginning of their meeting. Now her gaze was warm, full of emotions that she couldn't put into words. Cyrus felt it, and his heart stopped for a moment. It was the very moment when they both realized that their connection went beyond the usual acquaintance. It was the awakening of feelings, those feelings that they could not predict or control. Sabrina took another step towards him, and at that moment, everything froze. The forest, the stars, the wind, everything seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them in the center of this world. It was a moment of truth, a moment when their souls began to find each other on a deeper level than they could have expected. The night deepened, and the air, saturated with the scent of the forest, seemed thick and heavy like water. But for Cyrus and Serena, everything froze. Their interaction, the bond that had already begun to sprout between them, became the central point of their world. The sky above them, full of stars, reflected the infinity of space that connected and separated them at the same time. It was a place where their two worlds intersected, where everything could change in an instant. Serena stood in front of him, her eyes shining with the same quiet light that he had seen earlier. But now there was something more in them. That light no longer seemed cold and distant. It was softer, deeper, as if her mind had finally begun to accept this new world, to feel it in a way she hadn't been able to before. Everything that was foreign, alien, now became a part of her. Cyrus didn't move. He felt that every moment, every gesture, and every movement was important. There was something incredibly fragile between them, like a spider web stretched between 2 points. Any wrong move could destroy that bond, but it was something he didn't want to lose. He looked at Serena, trying to understand her, trying to comprehend the depth of the change that was happening in her. But he understood that it needed more than just a glance. It was a different level of connection beyond the ordinary human senses. She slowly raised her hand and stretched it out. as if she wanted to touch him again. The movement was careful, as if she was afraid that touching her might cause something irreversible. But there was no fear. There was only expectation, suspense, and a desire to find out what would happen next. When her fingers touched his arm, everything seemed to sink into even greater silence. This touch was not the same as before. This time it carried something more. It wasn't just learning or sensory perception. It was a desire to understand on a deep, unconscious level. Her touch was gentle, but it undoubtedly sent waves through his body, as if impulses were passing through his skin that connected them like the two poles of a magnet. Serenith felt her own body responding to his presence. It was a strange sensation, not physical arousal, but something on the level of consciousness, on the level of existence itself. There were no such contacts in her world. There were no emotional and energy connections that could affect the mind and body so deeply. She was beginning to realize that this world dictated its own laws, its own rhythms, and now her body and mind were slowly beginning to adapt to them. She closed her eyes for a moment, immersed in this feeling. Her mind flashed with vivid images, distant stars, gloomy planets, cold space. This was her home world. But now with every touch, with every breath, these images became less meaningful. The earth was beginning to replace them. The wind, light as a breath, passed over her face, and she felt how this touch became for her a part of something more, a part of her new reality. Her hand was still on his, and through that touch, she could feel the warmth of his body. It was more than just a physical connection. She began to realize that her body was adapting to this planet, to its atmosphere, and that it was not just a change at the cellular level. It was a change in her whole being, everything she knew about herself. Her body no longer perceived the earth as a threat. Now it felt like a new home. Cyrus also felt the changes. His body seemed to begin to perceive her presence on a level he couldn't explain. It was like a resonance, as if every cell in his body was responding to her touch. It wasn't just desire or physical attraction. It was something much more complicated. He could feel her energy flowing into him and his own energy flowing back to her. This exchange was quiet, almost imperceptible, but incredibly powerful. They stood there, connected by that simple touch, but on a level that didn't require words. An exchange began in their minds, not fully realized by them, but real. It was something ancient, deeply embedded in the very nature of existence, but for both of them it was a new and frightening experience. Serenith felt something new growing inside her. It was a feeling of warmth that spread throughout her body. It wasn't just a physical feeling, it was more than that. Her heart was beating faster, and she felt her emotions, which had always been under control, begin to awaken. It was both frightening and wonderful. She felt this process triggering changes inside her as her consciousness began to merge with his, as their two worlds began to intersect. She began to see images, scenes from his life, memories of things that were important to him. She saw his childhood, his loneliness, his dreams. These images were vivid, almost real. They flashed through her mind like flashes of light, and she plunged into them without resisting. It was a new experience for her to see other people's thoughts and feelings so clearly. And it helped her realize that a bond had already begun to form between them that surpassed anything she knew. Cyrus, in turn, began to see her world. He saw her planet, cold and far away, saw her people as strict and emotionless as she was in the beginning. He saw her mission, her loneliness in this endless space. These images filled his mind, and he began to realize how different she was, how different her world was from his own. But now, through this fusion of consciousness, he felt that she was getting closer to him, that their differences were no longer so great. They were both immersed in this process, this exchange that was slowly blurring the boundaries between their worlds. Serenith began to realize that her existence was no longer connected to her home planet. The Earth became her new home, but it wasn't just a biological or physical adaptation. It was something much deeper. She felt her consciousness becoming one with this world as her body began to perceive it as something of its own. Cyrus also felt this change. He knew that their bond was no longer just emotional or physical. It was something spiritual, something that connected them on a level that went beyond ordinary human relationships. It was a feeling that they had become part of one whole, that their two worlds had begun to merge into one. Serenith, still holding his hand, felt her body slowly begin to respond to this new world. She felt the energy of the earth passing through her as her body began to absorb this energy and turn it into something of its own. She felt the warmth of the earth under her feet, felt the wind on her skin, and it was no longer something alien to her. It became her new world. They stood in silence, connected by this invisible flow of energy that had already begun to change them both. Their two worlds merged together, and this fusion was not just physical or emotional. It was a fusion at the level of their souls, at the level of the very essence of their existence. Serenith no longer felt like a stranger in this world. She became a part of him, and this process, this merging of worlds, could no longer be stopped. The night continued to deepen, and the stars overhead twinkled as if watching two worlds separated by space and time for so long finally begin to merge. But merging worlds is always a process full of uncertainty, and Serenith and Cyrus now faced to trust their bond, which had become much more than just the interaction of two beings, began to weave their lives into an inextricable knot. But what happens next? How can a being who came from distant galaxies and a man from Earth cope with this new world that they created together? They were standing at the place where their paths met, on the edge of a cliff where the forest spread out under their feet, and the moonlight flooded their figures with a soft glow. The air was filled with humidity, which cooled under the touch of the night wind, bringing with it the aromas of forest grasses and damp earth. But for them, all this, space, sounds, even time itself, seemed to slow down. They didn't move, as if they were afraid to destroy the fragile fabric of what had arisen between. Serenith was aware that her body had adapted to this new world. But this adaptation was not only physical, it began to change deeper at the level of its very essence. She could feel her heart starting to beat in rhythm with this world. But now the question was, what next? Her mission, her purpose no longer mattered. This world became her reality, and everything that connected her to the past dissipated like smoke in the air. But merging with the new world did not mean completing the path. This was just the beginning. Her gaze was fixed on the distant stars, but now they did not beckon her home as before. Now they seemed distant, alien lights, devoid of the attractive power they had at the moment of her arrival. They became a reminder of what had happened, but they were no longer home. The house was here. This realization hit her harder than she could have expected. There was no way back anymore. Her body, her mind now belonged to the earth, and what she felt towards this man standing next to her only strengthened this decision. Iris, in turn, looked at her, trying to understand what was happening inside himself. The whole experience, everything that had happened to him in the last few hours, seemed incredible and unreal, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he was attracted to her. Not just physically, it was more than that. He felt that she had become an integral part of his life, even though they were from different worlds. But what did it mean to him? How could a man who lived alone, who was used to his solitude, cope with the fact that his life was now forever changed? They both stood on the threshold of a future that they could not predict. Serenith felt her heart grow heavy with realization. She was taught not to get attached to anything in particular, not to depend on one world or one life. But now she couldn't follow those rules anymore. The connection she felt with this planet, with this man, was stronger than anything she had known before. This world had become her new home, and its rhythms now dictated her choices. She took a slow step forward. Her feet made no sound on the wet grass, and her every movement was so smooth and confident, as if she had been a part of this land for a long time. Her breathing was even, but her heart was beating faster. There were a lot of emotions bubbling inside her that she couldn't fully comprehend. The future opened up before her like a new galaxy, and every step brought her closer to the unknown. Iris watched her, feeling something grow inside him that he couldn't name. It wasn't just attraction or fear of the unknown. It was a realization that he was faced with a choice that he couldn't make alone. It was a choice that had to be made by both of them. They were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were more than that now. Serenith stopped at the edge of the cliff and looked up at the stars once more. Her body, her mind, everything was ready for a new beginning, but she knew that this step would not be easy. She felt the weight of her choice. She had a way back, theoretically. Maybe some ship someday could take her away from here. But will she be the same Serenith already? This question hovered in her mind like a shadow that haunted her. She closed her eyes and felt her consciousness sink deeper into the very essence of her being. She was no longer the Serenith who had arrived on Earth. This new world awakened feelings in her that her civilization considered unnecessary. Emotions, affection, desire were alien to her people. But now they have become an integral part of her. It was like a release, but also a curse at the same time. At that moment, she realized that the future that awaited her could not be built on a return. It had to be connected with this planet, with its rhythms, with its life, but most of all, with the man who was standing next to him. He was the one who opened this world to her, who became the catalyst for her changes. But staying with him meant giving up everything she had known before, from everything that was once her reality. Cyrus, feeling the tension of the moment, also faced his choice. He understood that this was not just a chance meeting. Serenith became someone he couldn't let go of, but his world was just as complicated. What does it mean for a person accustomed to loneliness to accept someone into his life, especially when this someone came from another world, from another universe? How does this change his future? Did he even have a future if he took this step? The silence between them seemed as thick as the night itself. Both stood lost in their own thoughts, realizing that at that moment their lives had crossed so much that they could no longer exist apart. But the decision had to be made by both. They could no longer ignore what had arisen between them. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It wasn't just an emotional attachment. It was something deeper, like the very merging of their worlds. Serenith slowly turned around and looked at Cyrus. The full depth of her awareness was visible in her gaze. Her face remained calm, but there were sparks of internal conflict in her eyes. She couldn't say it in words, but her body, her movement spoke for her. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Cyrus also took a step forward. He felt this tension, this attraction, which did not let them stop. He knew that their destinies were now inextricably linked, and whatever choice they made, they had to make it together. It was like a leap into the abyss, a complete acceptance of the unknown. They were face to face, and at that moment, everything else lost its meaning. They were not just a human and an alien. They were two beings who found each other in the infinity of the universe. And now their future depended on only one decision, whether they would go down this path together. Serenith looked into his eyes and realized that she had already made her decision. She couldn't ignore what had happened anymore. Her world was destroyed, but a new one appeared in its place. This world was Earth, and she was ready to accept it. She didn't know what lay ahead, but at this moment, it didn't matter to her. She made her choice. Cyrus, feeling his heart beating faster, realized that he too had already made a decision. This choice was not rational, but it was the right one. The future, whatever it was now tied to her. It was a step into the unknown, but he knew he couldn't go back. They stood like that for a few moments until their worlds finally intertwined.